From the 18th to the 19th century, the British Empire boasted a galaxy of elites, which enabled it to rise from a mere corner of the British Isles to a super empire with a territory exceeding 30 million square kilometers. The 18th century marked the most splendid era of the Industrial Revolution for European powers. A host of nations like France, Russia, and Germany emerged one after another, only to decline in turn. However, the British Empire stood out, remaining prosperous and powerful, and became the top empire that could sway global trends. Why was the British Empire able to have the last laugh in every intricate game among the great powers? It was because Britain employed a brilliant political strategy in geopolitical maneuvering. This shrewd strategy can be described as being a troublemaker without destroying the latrine. To put it in plain terms, it means allying with the second-ranked power to take on the top one, and after defeating the top power, never going so far as to eliminate it completely. This way, the forces of European powers were kept in a state of mutual checks and balances, while Britain itself relentlessly expanded its strength across the globe. After defeating the Spaniards in the 16th century, the British gained the world's most powerful navy and firmly grasped sea control. When France rose in the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain joined forces with Prussia, Russia, and Austria to contain France, with this effort reaching its peak during the Napoleonic era. The British invested both money and manpower in organizing several anti-French alliances. They suffered repeated defeats but persisted in fighting, and eventually defeated Napoleon. After Napoleon's downfall, the British showed leniency. At the Congress of Vienna, they firmly opposed the dismemberment of France, allowing it to maintain territorial integrity to keep the growing Prussian Empire in check. In the mid-19th century, when the ambitious Russia expanded into Europe, Britain, along with France, the Ottoman Empire, and other countries, launched an attack on Russia. The Crimean War dealt a heavy blow to the Russians. In the late 19th century, as Germany rose, Britain allied with France and Russia to contain Germany. To make Russia focus on dealing with Germany in Eastern Europe, Britain, with the help of Japan, resolutely blocked Russia's expansion in the Far East. In the 1895 Sino-Japanese War, British capital purchased most of Japan's war bonds. During the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, British and American capital remained the main force supporting Japan's war machine. Thanks to this set of brilliant political strategies, the British Empire became the most powerful empire on which the sun never sets in human history by the end of the 19th century. At its prime, London was the international financial center, and the pound served as the main currency for international settlements. The territory of the British Empire not only reached an unprecedented 30 million square kilometers, but more importantly, the regions it controlled were all strategic hubs on the geopolitical map. It had numerous military bases around the Atlantic Ocean. Canada, with its rich resources, was a colony of the British Empire. The oil-producing areas in the Middle East were within its sphere of influence, and Egypt, which controlled the Suez Canal, was also its colony. South Africa, another colony, provided solid support for the pound with its abundant gold reserves. India, surrounding the Indian Ocean, was a colony. Malaysia, including Singapore, which controlled the strategic Malacca Strait, was a colony. Australia and New Zealand around the Pacific Ocean were colonies. The Yangtze River Delta region of China was within its sphere of influence, and Hong Kong was a colony. Japan, which held Ryukyu and Taiwan, was a distant ally of the British Empire. Such a vast world empire, which had greater influence on global affairs at the end of the 19th century than the United States does today, why did it decline rapidly after World War II and become a second-rate follower of the United States once its colony? It was because a plump figure stepped onto Britain's political stage in the 20th century. This plump figure was Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill's life was both glorious and disastrous for his country. He seemed to bring misfortune to whatever he did and suffered losses in whatever he invested. Although he only served as British Prime Minister for 5 years, he managed to squander the enormous family fortune of a world empire in such a short period, earning him the title of the biggest spendthrift in history. Now, let's take a look at the reckless moves in Churchill's life. Churchill was born in 1874 into an aristocratic family in Oxfordshire, England, a proper rich second generation. His teenage years coincided with the most glorious era of the British Empire. With his prominent family background and the glory of the empire, Churchill had a very high opinion of himself from an early age. He turned a blind eye to the political skills of the older generation of political elites in global game and diplomacy. Instead, he had the illusion of having a protagonist aura, thinking that Britain was the center of the world. and that the earth revolved around it. In Churchill's view, the relationship between Britain and the world was like that between a hammer and a nail. Britain could knock whoever it wanted. As for changes in the geopolitical map and the balance of various forces, they were not within Churchill's consideration. Such an arrogant rich second generation should have spent his life happily indulging in eating, drinking, whoring, and gambling. However, after the 20th century, the British Empire was short of talents, and Churchill had long-standing ambitions. With the support of his family, he actually rose rapidly in British politics. He entered the House of Commons in 1906 and then held important positions such as Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, Secretary of State for Commerce, Secretary of State for the Home Department, First Lord of the Admiralty, and Secretary of State for War. As soon as Churchill took up important positions, he began to let his country down. Before World War I, Europe was on the verge of war. The Allied powers led by Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central powers led by Germany and Austria, Hungary were desperately trying to win over neutral countries to join their own camps. Isn't the essence of diplomacy to make as many friends as possible and as few enemies as possible? However, Churchill, with his strange way of thinking, did not think like this. In the eyes of the rich second generation Churchill, the Central powers were not to be feared, so the British Empire had no need to put down its airs to make friends with some small countries. On the contrary, for some countries that Churchill looked down upon, he still had the hammer and nail thinking. A typical example of this thinking is the HMS Agincourt incident. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were two major countries regarded as sick men by the great powers in the world. The sick man of East Asia was China, and the sick man of West Asia was the Ottoman Turkey. The Ottoman Turkey was very similar to China in the late Qing dynasty. It had a huge territory, but was politically corrupt. At the end of the 19th century, this huge empire was on the verge of collapse. Greece became independent, North Africa was seized by France, and Egypt became a colony of Britain. Before World War I, the territory of the Ottoman Turkey had shrunk significantly. However, this country was in a key position on the geopolitical map. It connected Europe and Asia and controlled the strategic passage of the Turkish Straits, including the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait. With such a key position in the geopolitical map, logically, if Churchill had a little political sense, he should have understood that Turkey must be won over to the Allied powers. But Churchill had a strange way of thinking. Facing the enormous military pressure from the Central powers and with the war imminent, he was planning to carve up Turkey. The HMS Agincourt was originally a warship, ordered and built by Brazil in Britain. Later, Brazil ran out of money. The Sultan of Turkey also had a dream of enriching the country and strengthening the military. So he went all out, launching a national donation. It is said that even Turkish primary school students donated money and borrowing money from France. Finally, he raised the money and gave it to Britain, eagerly waiting for the British to deliver the goods. At the critical moment, Churchill ordered the forced seizure of the HMS Agincourt on the ground that Turkey might turn to Germany, completely cheating the Turks. They paid the money but didn't get the goods. What's more, it was the money donated by all the Turkish people. Imagine how angry the Turks were. At this time, Germany gave a great help. It immediately announced that it would give 2 new German warships, 1 battleship and 1 cruiser, in the Mediterranean to the Turks. With this in and out, there was no suspense. Turkey announced that it would join the Central Powers and declare war on the Allied powers. Turkey's turn to the Central Powers immediately blocked the Turkish Straits, which was a fatal blow to Russia. Russia in World War I was still an agricultural country with poor industrial capacity. Russia mobilized millions of troops on the Eastern Front. Relying solely on its domestic production capacity was absolutely insufficient. It was counting on the Allied powers to transport supplies through the Turkish Straits from the Mediterranean. Once the Turkish Straits were blocked, it was equivalent to cutting off Russia's supply line. The Russians, short of guns and ammunition, collapsed after fighting with Germany for 2 years. A revolution broke out in the country, and the first Bolshevik regime was established. You see, Churchill's reckless actions in his position as First Lord of the Admiralty directly contributed to the collapse of the ally Russia and indirectly contributed to the birth of the Soviet Union. The birth of the Soviet Union not only brought drastic changes to the global geopolitical map, making Britain lose an ally that could contain Germany, but also caused heavy economic losses to Britain. After the outbreak of World War I, in order to support Russia in resisting Germany, Britain provided huge financial assistance to Russia. The pound loan alone was £750 million. which was a huge sum of money in the 1910s. As a result, after the establishment of the Soviet Union, this huge sum of money went down the drain. The Socialist Soviet Union would not pay the debts borrowed by the Tsarist Russia. After Turkey entered the war, Churchill was furious and demanded that the Allied powers organize a large army to attack the Ottoman Turks. However, the European battlefield was already in a fever pitch at that time, and it was impossible to concentrate military resources in the Mediterranean. Therefore, the War Council rejected Churchill's request. In 1915, Russia requested Britain and France to provide support to attack the Turkish army. The Allied War Council then approved Churchill's request to send troops to Turkey, but there was a dispute over the specific direction of the operation. However, the arrogant and conceited Churchill insisted on his own way and hastily organized the famous Gallipoli campaign. This campaign, personally organized by Churchill, was a disaster for the Allied powers. The British Mediterranean fleet was defeated by the Turkish Antique Fleet, with 2 new German warships, and 7 British battleships were sunk. The army also suffered a heavy defeat, with 130 Allied soldiers killed and 260 injured. Churchill, in a way of sending people to their deaths, made Kemal, the father of Turkey, come to the fore. The top leadership of the Allied powers finally couldn't stand this fat man who made repeated mistakes. Churchill was dismissed from his post as First Lord of the Admiralty and completely removed from office. This was Churchill's first performance in British politics. When he was in charge of the Navy, he messed up the Navy. In the future, Churchill always maintained this magical rule. He messed up whatever he was in charge of. When he was in charge of the Navy, he messed up the Navy. When he was in charge of the Army, he messed up the Army. When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he messed up Britain's finance. When Churchill became Prime Minister, he directly messed up the country, reducing a world empire to a second-rate follower. Throughout human history, for a second-rate power to rise as the top dog, it would surely have to climb over heaps of bones and wade through pools of blood. The Americans, however, struck it lucky. They encountered Churchill, the biggest spendthrift in history, who practically handed over the throne of global dominance to the US with his own hands and even volunteered to be America's sidekick. After being ousted from office, Churchill's life fell on hard times. Though he had embezzled quite a lot during his tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty, he was always used to living large and had a knack for squandering money. It was at this time that he heard about the booming US stock market, so he sailed to America and became a mere chive in the world of stock trading. So, how did Churchill fare in his US stock market ventures? Let me put it this way. Imagine an exam hall where a plump man chews on his pen, deep in thought, and finally writes down a series of answers with great care. When the teacher grades his paper, it turns out all his answers are wrong. The paper is filled with mama writing, but the result is almost the same as a blank one because the total score is 0. That's just how legendary Churchill's stock trading skills were. In the 1910s, the US stock market was in a bull run. Yet whatever Churchill bought, its price plummeted without exception. Gradually, he became a well-known reverse indicator on the New York Stock Exchange. Later on, whenever Churchill bought a particular stock, a host of investors would rush to sell it off. After World War I ended in 1918, at the Paris Peace Conference, the British continued to play their balancing act and firmly opposed the dismemberment of Germany, which laid the groundwork for Hitler's rise later on. In January 1919, through all sorts of scheming, Churchill returned to the political arena once more, this time serving as Secretary of State for War and concurrently as Secretary of State for Air. Upon taking office, he actively pushed for the Allied powers' armed intervention in the Soviet Union. Well, in line with Churchill's pattern of ruining everything he touched, this armed intervention in the Soviet Union ended in a devastating failure, as was to be expected. In 1922, Churchill ungratefully deserted the Liberal Party, which had helped him make his way back to the political stage. In 1924, he joined the Conservative Party and took up the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. As Chancellor, Churchill went on to showcase his talent for messing up whatever he did. After World War I, the British economy was truly battered. To win the war, the British had exploited their colonies relentlessly, leaving the colonies seething with resentment. What was most troubling was the external bond and debt structure. At that time, Britain's external liabilities stood at £1.285 billion, mainly owed to the United States, while its external claims were as high as £1.419 billion, These were all debts lent to its allies. For instance, Russia owed a whopping £750 million, and with Russia's collapse and the establishment of the Soviet Union, this debt was never going to be recovered. There were also hundreds of millions of pounds owed by France, but France had been hit so hard by the war that it couldn't repay the debt in the short term. So Britain was actually in a state of net liability back then. With high external debts and exports being squeezed by American and Japanese goods, export volumes dropped sharply. Before World War I, all major European powers had adopted the gold standard. But once the war broke out, there was a massive loss of gold. So during the war, powers including Britain had abolished the gold standard. Therefore, with plummeting exports and high external debts, Britain's best strategy would have been to adopt a credit currency system, use the central bank to control the pound's exchange rate, boost the competitiveness of its export products through currency depreciation, and at the same time reduce the actual repayment of external debts. But how did Churchill act? In 1925, he resolutely announced the restoration of the gold standard for the pound, pegging it to gold and using gold as an anchor to fix the pound's exchange rate, which in effect meant an appreciation of the pound. Why did Churchill do this? Because he was still living in the glory days when Britain was an empire on which the sun never set. In his eyes, the currency of the mighty British Empire should be the strongest in the world, and London should still be the rightful international financial center. He chose to turn a blind eye to realities, such as the United States' gradual rise, including the fact that more than a third of the world's gold was concentrated in the US, and that Britain's gold reserves were severely insufficient. This series of reckless moves dealt a heavy blow to the British economy. British exports continued to shrink, and investors sold off pounds to exchange for gold, causing Britain's gold reserves to dwindle sharply. Gold kept flowing to the United States at an accelerating rate, and by the 1930s, the US held nearly 40% of the world's gold reserves. In 1930, a major economic crisis broke out in Western countries, and the pound, which was pegged to gold, was frantically sold off by investors. The British government couldn't hold on any longer and announced again in 1931 that the pound would be decoupled from gold. This move, a desperate attempt to survive by cutting off a limb, infuriated Churchill. This plump man had a bizarre way of thinking and never learned to assess the situation throughout his life. As a result, Churchill resigned once again and started writing full-time at home. British politics, without Churchill, went on with its balancing acts on the European continent. Yet politicians like Chamberlain were clumsy in their tactics, a far cry from the elite forebears of the British Empire. Hitler's rise was actually a result of Britain's appeasement policy. Back then, the British were bent on diverting the disaster eastward, trying to guide Germany to turn east and engage in a firefight with the Soviet Union, so that they could sit on the sidelines and reap the benefits in the end. But Hitler and Stalin were no fools. How could they act as the British intended? The more Britain and France pushed for diverting the disaster eastward, the more it led to the alignment between Germany and the Soviet Union. The two not only signed a non-aggression pact but also secretly divided their spheres of influence in Europe. World War II broke out in 1939. Germany and the Soviet Union advanced from east and west, carving up Poland within a month. In the meantime, Britain and France waged a phony war on the Western Front, watching Poland's fall helplessly. After Poland's demise, Chamberlain was under immense public pressure and had no choice but to bring Churchill, who had always advocated a hard line against Germany, into the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. After taking up the post, Churchill volunteered to actively organize the Norwegian campaign, which of course ended in a fiasco. Remember this basic rule: whether in World War I or World War II, any military operation personally organized by Churchill, a graduate of the Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, was absolutely a disastrous defeat with heavy casualties. In May 1940, Germany launched an attack on France, and Chamberlain's appeasement policy collapsed completely. Churchill succeeded Chamberlain as Prime Minister of the British Empire, and also served as Minister of Defense. Under the wartime system, Churchill almost held absolute power over the British Empire. He served as Prime Minister for 5 years, and in just these 5 years, he turned a world empire with colonies all over the globe into a second-rate island country. And this was against the backdrop of Britain winning the anti-fascist war. Let's take a look at the series of astonishingly reckless moves Churchill made during his tenure as Prime Minister. After France surrendered, Hitler launched a peace offensive against Britain, Germany was a traditional land power while Britain was a traditional sea power. Hitler knew very well that it was not worthwhile for a land power to engage in a life-or-death struggle with a sea power. After all, no matter how strong the German army was, it couldn't directly land on the British Isles, and the British Empire's world-leading navy was an insurmountable obstacle for Germany. So, after defeating France, Hitler was eager to reach a peace agreement with Britain. As long as Britain recognized Germany's dominance in Europe and didn't interfere with Germany's maritime trade, peace could be achieved between Britain and Germany. From Britain's perspective, what was the best strategy at that time? The best strategy was to sign a peace agreement with Germany. At that time, both the United States and the Soviet Union were watching. Germany was at the peak of its power, and a life-or-death struggle with Germany was neither promising nor wise. Britain could have taken a step back, ceded some interest on the continent, and gained a chance to catch its breath. After Germany and Britain reconciled, Germany would sooner or later act against the Soviet Union. At that time, Britain could have recovered its strength while watching the fight from the sidelines, and then found a proper opportunity to drag the United States into the war to secure victory. But how did Churchill act? He flatly rejected Hitler's peace proposal, determined to fight Germany to the death. To fight Germany to the death, Churchill was really willing to pay any price, and this any price meant that the foundation built by generations of the British Empire could be discarded. This included the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, signed with the United States in September 1940. Britain leased 8 military bases around the Atlantic to the United States for 99 years, in exchange for 50 outdated destroyers from the United States. The 8 military bases that Britain had painstakingly built around the Atlantic for generations were directly sold cheaply to the Americans by Churchill without hesitation, and all he got was to strengthen the escort force for his own maritime transportation. Then, he borrowed money from various dominions including Canada and Australia to supplement military expenditures, on the condition that he promised these countries independence after the war. He frantically plundered materials and resources from India, again on the condition of promising India independence after the war. Churchill went all out, risking the foundation built by his ancestors. All for what? Just to fight Hitler to the death? I've searched through all the materials and still can't find the reason for Churchill's madness. From the perspective of the global anti-fascist cause, what Churchill did was politically correct. But from Britain's perspective, it was very unwise. Then came the Battle of Britain. The British tried their best to barely hold on to Britain's airspace, but the cost was that the decent factories on the British Isles were bombed into ruins. At the same time, the German submarine force choked Britain's supply lines, and most of the resources that the British struggled to extract from their colonies were sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, all the people of the British Empire had to tighten their belts to accompany Churchill in fighting Germany to the death. In 1942, the Pacific War broke out. Japan, the evil dog that Britain had nurtured for decades, began to bite its master back, tearing a large piece of flesh from the British Empire. Think about it. If Britain had made a truce with Germany in 1940, even if Japan was given 100 times the courage, it wouldn't have dared to act against Britain. The Japanese army made a strong start in the battles in Southeast Asia, and Britain's colonies in Asia collapsed completely. Hong Kong fell, Singapore fell, Burma fell. If it weren't for the support of the Americans, India would probably have been lost too. Losing the Asian colonies was bad enough, but Churchill continued his reckless actions, which made Australia and New Zealand cold-hearted. The Japanese army swept through Southeast Asia, captured the Philippines, and bombed Darwin. Under the threat of the Japanese army, both Australia and New Zealand were shocked nationwide. But the main forces of the armies of Australia and New Zealand were stuck in the quagmire of North Africa, fighting Rommel. As a result, public opinion in both countries surged, strongly demanding that their troops be recalled to defend their homelands. In this situation, Churchill showed his selfish nature again, and flatly rejected the request of Australia and New Zealand to recall their troops. What was there to fight for in the barren land of North Africa? Britain concentrated several times more manpower and material resources in North Africa than Rommel, and even if the troops of Australia and New Zealand were recalled, it would have been possible to hold Egypt. This caused a stir in the military morale of the two countries' armies, and then made the people of both countries hold a grudge. After World War II, they immediately abandoned Britain and turned to the United States for support. You see, this is how Churchill gradually squandered the foundation built by generations of the British Empire. Churchill was not just a squanderer of the British Empire. He also carried a curse of bringing woe to allies. There was no WWW ally that escaped being let down by him. On the Burma battlefield, when British troops were surrounded by the Japanese, they frantically turned to China for help. After the Chinese Expeditionary Force fought tooth and nail to break the siege for the British withdrew entirely without so much as a word of warning, leaving the Expeditionary Force trapped in the Japanese encirclement. After a desperate breakout, over half of the 100-strong Expeditionary Force was lost. In 1943, the global anti-fascist war had already achieved significant victories. With the Allies seemingly on the verge of launching a counteroffensive in Europe to end the war early, Churchill, at this critical juncture, proposed a plan to Roosevelt. Italy was the weak link among the Axis powers. If they launched a counterattack through Italy, victory would be swift. Over the next 2 years, the Allied forces that landed in Italy got stuck in the quagmire of the Apennine Peninsula. They suffered heavy casualties, yet the narrow terrain of the peninsula left them unable to gain any real momentum. In 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, landing directly in Normandy, France. By the time the Allies had pushed into Germany, the Allied forces that had landed in Italy a year earlier were still bogged down in the Italian stalemate. He also betrayed the Poles. In 1944, the Soviet Red Army entered Polish territory. In a bid to seize political control, Churchill egged on the Polish government in exile to stage an uprising in Warsaw before the Red Army arrived, all to ensure that Poland would be a pro-Western regime in the post-war geopolitical landscape. To get the Poles to launch the Warsaw Uprising ahead of time, Churchill, on one hand, pledged to provide military support, including air bombings and U.S. airborne troops, and on the other hand, told the Poles to keep the plan secret from the Soviet Union. On August 1, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising broke out. The German army deployed massive forces to suppress the Polish rebels, but Churchill's promised aid never materialized. The Red Army, which was closing in on Warsaw, halted and watched quietly as bloodshed unfolded across the river. Poland has had a turbulent history, yet it's hard to feel sympathy for the country. The reason is simple. This nation and its people are truly eccentric. First and foremost, it is the most steadfast anti-China force in Europe. Other countries may oppose China out of self-interest or ideological differences, but Poland's anti-China stance is purely irrational and erratic. When the September 18th incident broke out in 1931, news reached Europe, and most countries condemned Japan with one exception: Poland. Polish citizens took to the streets spontaneously to celebrate Japan's atrocities. Was Poland an ally of Japan? No. At that time, Poland didn't even have diplomatic relations with Japan, but that didn't stop Poland from being the first to recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo. Incidentally, Poland is also currently the only country in Europe that has signed an agreement with the United States explicitly excluding Huawei. The Red Army's decision to stand by and watch was rooted not only in complex historical factors, but also in realistic geopolitical considerations from the Soviet perspective. It would never tolerate an anti-Soviet Poland on its border. If the Polish government in exile had triumphed in Warsaw, the future Polish government would undoubtedly have been a staunchly anti-Soviet regime. This is no conjecture of mine. When Poland gained independence in 1918, the Soviet Union was the first to recognize it. How did Poland repay this goodwill? Incited by Britain and France, Poland organized an army to invade the Soviet Union, engaging in looting and even capturing Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. By the end of December 1944, the Warsaw Uprising had failed. Tens of thousands of Poles were killed and hundreds of thousands were sent to German concentration camps. Churchill once again spoke out to accuse the Red Army of standing idly by. Well, I can only scoff. Did Churchill really have no clue what the British and French armies were doing on the Western Front when Germany invaded Poland in 1939? Then came the Battle of Britain. The British tried their best to barely hold on to Britain's airspace, but the cost was that the decent factories on the British Isles were bombed into ruins. At the same time, the German submarine force choked Britain's supply lines, and most of the resources that the British struggled to extract from their colonies were sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, all the people of the British Empire had to tighten their belts to accompany Churchill in fighting Germany to the death. In 1942, the Pacific War broke out. Japan, the evil dog that Britain had nurtured for decades, began to bite its master back, tearing a large piece of flesh from the British Empire. Think about it. If Britain had made a truce with Germany in 1940, even if Japan was given 100 times the courage, it wouldn't have dared to act against Britain. The Japanese army made a strong start in the battles in Southeast Asia, and Britain's colonies in Asia collapsed completely. Hong Kong fell, Singapore fell, Burma fell. If it weren't for the support of the Americans, India would probably have been lost too. Losing the Asian colonies was bad enough, but Churchill continued his reckless actions, which made Australia and New Zealand cold-hearted. The Japanese army swept through Southeast Asia, captured the Philippines, and bombed Darwin. Under the threat of the Japanese army, both Australia and New Zealand were shocked nationwide, but the main forces of the armies of Australia and New Zealand were stuck in the quagmire of North Africa fighting Rommel. As a result, public opinion in both countries surged, strongly demanding that their troops be recalled to defend their homelands. In this situation, Churchill showed his selfish nature again and flatly rejected the request of Australia and New Zealand to recall their troops. What was there to fight for in the barren land of North Africa? Britain concentrated several times more manpower and material resources in North Africa than Rommel, and even if the troops of Australia and New Zealand were recalled, it would have been possible to hold Egypt. This caused a stir in the military morale of the two countries' armies, and then made the people of both countries hold a grudge. After World War II, they immediately abandoned Britain and turned to the United States for support. You see, this is how Churchill gradually squandered the foundation built by generations of the British Empire. After celebrating the victory of the anti-fascist war in 1945, the British suddenly found that they seemed to be the biggest losers. Gold outflow, high debt, foreign debt as high as 37 billion, the pound lost its status as a world currency. Colonies became independent one after another. Its territory was reduced to a palm-sized island country. Its soldiers and civilians suffered heavy casualties, and its territory was bombed into ruins. In just a few years, the British Empire has been reduced from a leading power in the world to a second-rate follower who looks at the eyes of the Americans. The British people can't stand this fat man anymore. In 1946, Chu Fatty stepped down, but Chu Fatty was in the British political arena. In 1951, he came back and became Prime Minister again. In 1955, he finally got out completely. In 1953, Chu Fatty won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his 4 volumes of Churchill's memoirs, which eulogized himself but was far from the real history. This award makes me seriously suspect that the Americans are behind the manipulation of the Americans from the second to the first without any effort, and they have to give Chu Fatty a medal anyway. Otherwise, even if the members of the Nobel Committee are blind, it is impossible to see Chu Fatty's bullshit memoirs. In the past 2 years, because of trade frictions between China and the United States, a new term is very popular, that is Thucydides' trap, which means that a new rising power is bound to challenge the existing power, and the existing power is bound to respond to this threat, so that war becomes inevitable. But judging from the history of Britain's decline, this Thucydides trap can be completely avoided as long as a world power has a systematic convulsion and a great man like Chu Fatty comes to power.